Confucius, The Gentle Path to Wisdom. A bedtime documentary in the misty hills of ancient China, where bamboo groves swayed gently in the evening breeze and rivers flowed like liquid jade through valleys painted in shades of emerald and gold. There lived a man whose wisdom would echo through the centuries like a gentle lullaby for the human soul. His name was Confucius, though the world would come to know him as Confucius, the gentle teacher whose words carried the power to transform hearts and minds across generations. Born in the year 551 before the Common Era, in the small state of Lu, Confucius entered a world marked by turmoil and uncertainty, where kingdoms rose and fell like waves upon the shore, and where the ancient ways seemed to be dissolving into chaos and confusion. The China of Confucius's time was not the unified empire we might imagine, but rather a patchwork of feudal states locked in perpetual struggle for dominance. The Zhou dynasty, once mighty and respected, had fragmented into countless smaller kingdoms, each ruled by lords who paid little more than lip service to the distant emperor. It was an age historians would later call the Spring and Autumn period, a poetic name that belied the violence and instability that characterized these centuries. Wars raged between neighboring states, diplomatic agreements were broken as easily as morning frost dissolves under the sun, and the ancient rituals and customs that had once bound society together were increasingly ignored or forgotten. Into this world of uncertainty came a child who would spend his life searching for ways to restore harmony, peace, and moral order to human society. Confucius was born into a family of minor nobility, though by his time their fortunes had declined considerably. His father, Filial, he was a soldier and minor official known for his physical strength and courage in battle. Family legends spoke of incredible feats of strength, including one occasion when he supposedly held up a heavy gate with his bare hands to allow his comrades to escape from an enemy fortress. But despite his father's reputation as a warrior, the family lived in relative poverty. When Confucius was only 3 years old, his father died, leaving the boy to be raised by his mother, Junzi, in circumstances that were often difficult and sometimes desperate. Growing up in poverty taught the young Confucius valuable lessons about human nature and the importance of perseverance. He learned early that nobility of character mattered far more than nobility of birth, and that true worth came not from inherited status but from one's actions and moral choices. His mother, despite their financial hardships, ensured that he received the best education possible. In ancient China, education was not merely about learning to read and write, but about cultivating one's character and understanding one's place in the cosmic order. The curriculum included the 6 arts: ritual, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. But for Confucius, learning went far beyond these formal subjects. He was fascinated by the ancient texts and traditions, spending countless hours studying the Book of Changes, the Book of Songs, and the historical records that preserved the wisdom of earlier generations. Even as a young man, Confucius displayed an unusual combination of intellectual curiosity and practical wisdom. He understood that knowledge without application was merely academic exercise, while action without understanding was dangerous and potentially destructive. This balance between thought and action, between theory and practice, would become one of the defining characteristics of his teaching philosophy. As he grew older, he began to work in various government positions, starting with humble roles such as bookkeeper and livestock supervisor. These early jobs, though modest, gave him invaluable insight into how government actually functioned at the ground level. He saw how policies made in the capital affected ordinary people in villages and towns, and he witnessed firsthand both the potential for good governance and the devastation that could result from corruption and incompetence. It was during these formative years that Confucius began to develop his understanding of what he would later call Ren, often translated as benevolence or humaneness, but encompassing a much broader concept of what it means to be truly human. Ren involves not just kindness toward others, but a deep recognition of our fundamental interconnectedness, of understanding that our individual well-being is inseparable from the welfare of our community and society as a whole. This insight came not from abstract philosophical speculation, but from his daily observations of human behavior and his growing awareness of how individual actions ripple outward to affect countless others. As Confucius matured, his reputation as a wise and trustworthy person began to spread. People sought his advice on matters both personal and professional, and he discovered that he had a natural gift for teaching. Unlike many educators of his time, who focused primarily on rote memorization and rigid adherence to established formulas, Confucius encouraged his students to think critically and to find their own path to understanding. He believed that the best teachers were those who could kindle the spark of curiosity in their students' minds, rather than simply filling their heads with information. His teaching method, which he called learning by analogy, involved presenting students with one corner of a problem and encouraging them to work out the other three corners for themselves. At the age of 30, Confucius made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He opened his own school and began accepting students from all social backgrounds. This was revolutionary for his time, when education was typically reserved for the wealthy and aristocratic. Confucius declared that anyone who came to him with sincere desire to learn, even if they could bring nothing more than a bundle of dried meat as payment, would be welcome in his classroom. This democratic approach to education reflected his deep belief that human nature is fundamentally good and that everyone, regardless of their birth or circumstances, has the potential for moral and intellectual growth. The students who gathered around Confucius came from remarkably diverse backgrounds. There was Yan Hui, a young man of exceptional intelligence and moral sensitivity who came from a poor family, but whose questions and insights often surprised even his master. There was Zilu, a former soldier, whose initial roughness and impulsiveness gradually gave way to thoughtful consideration under Confucius's patient guidance. Zigong was a successful merchant who brought practical knowledge of human psychology and market dynamics to their discussions. And there were many others, each bringing their own perspectives and experiences to the rich dialogue that characterized life in the Confucian school. The relationship between Confucius and his students was unlike anything seen in traditional Chinese education. Rather than maintaining a stern, authoritative distance, Confucius encouraged informal discussion and even friendly debate. He often said that he learned as much from his students as they learned from him, and he was never too proud to admit when he didn't know something or when a student had raised a point he hadn't considered. This humility and openness created an atmosphere of mutual respect and genuine intellectual inquiry that attracted students from across China and beyond. Central to Confucius's teaching was the concept of li, usually translated as ritual or propriety, but encompassing a much broader understanding of how human beings can live together in harmony. Li refers not just to formal ceremonies and religious observances, but to all the countless small courtesies and considerations that make social life possible. When we greet each other politely, when we show respect for our elders, when we fulfill our promises and treat others with dignity, we are practicing li. Confucius understood that these social forms were not empty gestures, but rather the external expression of internal virtues. Just as a beautiful piece of music requires both technical skill and emotional expression, a harmonious society requires both genuine compassion and the practical knowledge of how to express that compassion in daily interactions. Another key concept in Confucian thought is Junzi, often translated as gentleman or noble person, but referring not to aristocratic birth, but to moral character. The Junzi is someone who has cultivated virtue to such a degree that their actions naturally promote harmony and well-being in their community. Such a person leads by example rather than by force, and their influence spreads like ripples in a pond, gradually transforming everyone around them. Confucius believed that if enough people could cultivate themselves to become Junzi, society as a whole would naturally become more just, peaceful, and prosperous. The process of becoming a Junzi requires what Confucius called self-cultivation or self-improvement. This is not a one-time achievement, but a lifelong journey of continuous learning and moral development. It begins with honest self-examination, recognizing our own flaws and limitations without either excessive self-criticism or self-deception. From this foundation of self-knowledge, we can begin to work on gradually improving our character, developing qualities such as compassion, wisdom, courage, and justice. But this self-cultivation is not a solitary pursuit. Confucius emphasized that we develop our character through our relationships with others, through our service to our communities, and through our engagement with the broader world. One of the most famous teachings of Confucius is what has become known as the Golden Rule, though he expressed it in negative form. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. This principle of reciprocity underlies all ethical behavior in Confucian thought. Before we act, we should consider how we would feel if we were in the other person's position. This simple test, if consistently applied, would eliminate most forms of cruelty, injustice, and conflict from human life. But Confucius went beyond this basic principle to explore the more subtle aspects of how we can contribute to each other's well-being and happiness. Family relationships held special importance in Confucian ethics. Confucius taught that the family is the foundation of society and that the virtues we learn in our interactions with parents, siblings, and children form the basis for all other social relationships. The concept of xiao, usually translated as filial piety, refers to the deep respect and care we owe to our parents and ancestors. But this is not blind obedience. Rather, it involves understanding our parents as complete human beings, recognizing both their strengths and their limitations, and finding ways to honor them while still maintaining our own moral integrity. A truly filial child might sometimes need to gently disagree with their parents or guide them away from harmful actions, but this would be done with love, patience, and respect. From the harmony of family life, Confucius believed, would naturally flow the harmony of the broader community. A person who has learned to be considerate of family members will extend that consideration to neighbors, colleagues, and eventually even to strangers. Someone who has developed patience in dealing with the frustrations and disappointments of family life will be better equipped to handle the challenges of public service or professional responsibilities. And a person who has experienced the deep satisfaction of contributing to their family's well-being will naturally seek opportunities to serve their community and society. Education, for Confucius, was not just about acquiring knowledge or developing skills, but about becoming a more complete human being. He believed that learning should engage not just the intellect, but also the emotions and the moral sense. True education transforms not just what we know, but who we are. It makes us more compassionate, more wise, more capable of contributing to the well-being of others. This is why Confucius placed such emphasis on literature, music, and history in his curriculum. These subjects do more than convey information. They cultivate sensitivity, imagination, and moral insight. Poetry and literature expose us to the full range of human experience, helping us understand perspectives different from our own and deepening our capacity for empathy. Music, which Confucius considered especially important, has the power to harmonize our emotions and create a sense of unity between people. When we sing together or play music together, the boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve, and we experience something of the harmony that should characterize human relationships more generally. History provides us with examples of both virtue and vice, showing us the long-term consequences of different kinds of choices and helping us develop practical wisdom for dealing with contemporary challenges. But Confucius was not an impractical idealist who believed that good intentions alone were sufficient to create a better world. He understood that moral principles must be embodied in concrete institutions and practical policies. This is why he spent a significant portion of his life seeking opportunities to serve in government, where he could apply his insights about human nature and social harmony to the actual work of governance. His brief period as a high-ranking official in the state of Lu gave him the chance to demonstrate that Confucian principles could indeed produce tangible improvements in people's lives. Under his administration, crime rates dropped significantly, economic conditions improved, and there was a general sense that government was serving the people rather than merely extracting resources from them. However, Confucius's success as an administrator also brought him into conflict with powerful interests who benefited from the existing system of corruption and exploitation. When it became clear that his reforms were threatening the privileges of the wealthy and powerful, he was forced to resign from his position and leave his home state. This began what historians call his period of wandering, during which he and a small group of loyal disciples traveled from kingdom to kingdom, seeking a ruler who would be willing to implement Confucian principles of government. These years of exile were difficult and sometimes dangerous. Confucius and his followers faced poverty, illness, and occasionally even physical threats from those who saw their ideas as subversive or threatening. There were times when they went without adequate food or shelter, and occasions when local authorities viewed them with suspicion or hostility. But these hardships also deepened Confucius's understanding of human nature and strengthened his commitment to his principles. He learned that it is easy to be virtuous when life is comfortable and secure, but true character is revealed in how we respond to adversity and setback. During these wandering years, Confucius encountered many different kinds of people and witnessed many different approaches to governance and social organization. He saw kingdoms ruled by wise and benevolent monarchs where people lived in relative peace and prosperity. He also saw states dominated by cruel tyrants where fear and oppression were the norm. These experiences confirmed his belief that the character of leaders has enormous influence on the well-being of their subjects. A ruler who is genuinely concerned with serving the people will naturally create policies and institutions that promote human flourishing. But a leader who is motivated primarily by personal gain or the desire for power will inevitably create systems that exploit and harm the very people they are supposed to protect. One of the insights that emerged from these years of travel was Confucius's understanding of the relationship between personal virtue and political effectiveness. He observed that leaders who tried to maintain power through force and intimidation might achieve short-term success, but ultimately created instability and resentment that would lead to their downfall. By contrast, leaders who governed through moral example and genuine concern for their subjects' welfare created loyalty and cooperation that made their rule both more effective and more enduring. This led Confucius to develop his theory of virtuous government, or government by moral example. According to this theory, the most powerful tool available to any leader is not weapons or wealth or legal authority, but their own character. When people see their leaders living according to high moral standards, they are naturally inspired to elevate their own behavior. When they witness leaders making personal sacrifices for the common good, they become more willing to contribute to collective efforts. And when they observe leaders treating all people with fairness and respect regardless of their social status, they begin to extend that same courtesy to their own interactions with others. Of course, Confucius was realistic enough to understand that moral example alone would not be sufficient to maintain order in society. Laws and punishments would still be necessary to deal with those who chose to disregard social norms and harm others. But he believed that in a well-ordered society, legal sanctions would be needed only rarely because most people would be motivated by positive examples rather than fear of punishment. The goal was to create a culture in which doing the right thing was seen as natural and desirable, rather than something imposed from outside by threats and coercion. After many years of unsuccessful searching for a ruler willing to implement his ideas, Confucius finally returned to his home state of Lu. By this time, he was an old man, worn down by years of travel and disappointment, but still committed to his mission of moral and social reform. Since he had been unable to transform society through political action, he decided to focus his remaining years on education and writing. He believed that if he could train a generation of students in Confucian principles, they would eventually find opportunities to apply these ideas in their own careers and communities. The school that Confucius established during these final years became a kind of laboratory for testing and refining his ideas about education and human development. Students came not just to learn academic subjects, but to participate in a community dedicated to mutual support and moral improvement. They studied together, ate together, and engaged in long discussions about ethics, politics, literature, and philosophy. Many of the sayings and teachings that we associate with Confucius today actually emerged from these informal conversations with his students. The atmosphere in the school was relaxed and informal, quite different from the rigid hierarchies that characterized most educational institutions of the time. Confucius encouraged his students to question his ideas and to challenge each other's assumptions. He believed that truth emerged through dialogue and debate, not through passive acceptance of authority. Students were expected to take responsibility for their own learning and to help teach and mentor younger students. This created a sense of shared purpose and mutual accountability that strengthened the bonds within the community. One of the distinctive features of Confucian education was its emphasis on the integration of intellectual, emotional, and moral development. Students didn't just learn facts and theories, they learned how to apply knowledge in ways that would benefit themselves and others. They studied not just to satisfy their curiosity or to prepare for careers, but to become better human beings. This holistic approach to education reflected Confucius's belief that the ultimate purpose of learning is not personal advancement, but service to others. The relationships that developed between Confucius and his students were characterized by genuine affection and mutual respect. Many of the students remained close to their teacher throughout his life, and several of them went on to become influential teachers and officials in their own right. These relationships provided Confucius with some of his deepest satisfactions, particularly during the difficult years when his political ambitions remained unfulfilled. He often said that his greatest achievement was not any position he had held or any reform he had implemented, but the young people he had helped to develop their potential and find their own paths to wisdom and service. As Confucius aged, he spent increasing amounts of time working on literary projects. He edited and compiled several of the ancient texts that would later become central to Chinese education, including the Book of Songs, the Book of History, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. These editorial efforts were not merely scholarly exercises. They represented his attempt to preserve and transmit the wisdom of earlier generations to future students. He believed that each generation had a responsibility to pass on the best insights and achievements of their predecessors, while also adding their own contributions to the accumulated wisdom of humanity. The Book of Songs, which Confucius edited from a larger collection of ancient poetry, illustrates his approach to education and moral development. Rather than simply preserving these poems as historical curiosities, he selected and arranged them to illustrate important principles about human relationships, social responsibility, and the connection between individual character and social harmony. Students who studied these poems didn't just learn about ancient Chinese literature. They absorbed lessons about love, loyalty, justice, and compassion that remained relevant to their own lives and challenges. Similarly, the Spring and Autumn Annals, which records the political events of Confucius's home state over several centuries, was shaped by his belief that history should serve as a moral teacher. By carefully selecting which events to include and how to describe them, Confucius created a historical narrative that illustrated the consequences of different kinds of political choices. Rulers who governed wisely and justly were shown to enjoy long and prosperous reigns, while those who were cruel or corrupt eventually faced rebellion and defeat. This approach to historical writing reflected Confucius's conviction that the past could provide valuable guidance for present and future decision-making, but only if it was interpreted through the lens of moral wisdom. In his final years, Confucius also devoted considerable attention to developing what would later become known as his political philosophy. He believed that the key to good government lay not in complex laws or elaborate institutions, but in the character of the people who held positions of authority. If rulers were genuinely virtuous, they would naturally make decisions that promoted the welfare of their subjects. If they lacked moral character, no amount of legal restraint or institutional oversight would prevent them from abusing their power. This emphasis on the moral qualifications of leaders led Confucius to develop detailed ideas about how government officials should be selected and trained. Rather than choosing leaders based on their family connections or their ability to pay for positions, he advocated for a merit-based system in which candidates would be evaluated on their knowledge, their character, and their commitment to serving others. This was a radical idea for his time, when political positions were typically inherited or purchased, and it would not be fully implemented in China for several more centuries. Confucius envisioned a government staffed by what he called scholar officials, people who combined broad learning with practical wisdom and moral integrity. These individuals would be selected through competitive examinations that tested not just their knowledge of history, literature, and philosophy, but also their ability to apply this knowledge to real-world problems. Once in office, they would be expected to continue their education and moral development throughout their careers, always striving to become more effective servants of the public good. The ideal ruler, in Confucian thought, would be someone who embodied all the virtues that citizens were expected to cultivate in their own lives. Such a leader would be compassionate but not weak, firm but not harsh, confident but not arrogant. They would make decisions based on careful consideration of their long-term consequences for all segments of society, not just for the wealthy and powerful. And they would be willing to accept personal sacrifice when necessary to advance the common good. But Confucius understood that even the most virtuous ruler would need the support of equally virtuous ministers and advisors. This is why he placed so much emphasis on education and moral development. He believed that if enough people could be trained in the principles of ethical behavior and effective governance, they would eventually rise to positions of influence where they could implement reforms and improvements. Change might come slowly through this approach, but it would be more thorough and more lasting than reforms imposed from above without broad-based support. The concept of rectification of names was another important element in Confucian political philosophy. Confucius observed that much social and political confusion arose from the misuse of language, calling things by names that didn't accurately describe their true nature. When rulers called themselves fathers of the people while actually exploiting and oppressing their subjects, When officials claimed to serve the public interest while actually pursuing personal gain, when institutions described themselves in ways that bore no relationship to their actual functions, it became impossible for citizens to make informed judgments about political affairs. The solution, according to Confucius, was to insist on precise and honest use of language. Words should correspond to realities. If someone claimed to be a leader, they should actually lead. If an institution claimed to serve the public, it should actually serve the public. This might seem like a small matter, but Confucius believed that clear thinking and honest communication were essential prerequisites for good governance. When people could trust that words meant what they appeared to mean, it became possible to have productive discussions about policy and to hold leaders accountable for their promises and commitments. As Confucius entered the final phase of his life, he had the satisfaction of seeing some of his former students begin to achieve positions of influence and responsibility. Though he had not been able to transform society as quickly or as thoroughly as he had hoped, he could see that his ideas were beginning to spread and take root. Students who had learned Confucian principles in his school were becoming teachers themselves, passing on these insights to a new generation. Others were entering government service and attempting to apply Confucian approaches to administration and policy making. The personal losses of these final years were significant. Several of his most beloved students died before he did, including Yan Hui, whom he had regarded almost as a son. His own son also predeceased him, leaving the aging philosopher to grapple with profound grief and the sense that his family line might not continue. These experiences of loss deepened his understanding of the universal human experiences of suffering and mortality, and reinforced his conviction that the meaning of life comes not from personal achievements or acquisitions, but from the relationships we build and the positive influence we have on others. Despite these sorrows, Confucius remained active in teaching and writing almost until the end of his life. He continued to receive visitors who sought his advice on personal and political matters, and he maintained correspondence with former students who had scattered across China to pursue their own careers. His reputation as a wise and compassionate teacher had spread far beyond his home region, and people traveled great distances to spend even a brief time in his presence. When Confucius died in the year 479 before the Common Era at the age of 72, he was mourned not only by his immediate circle of students and friends, but by countless others whose lives had been touched by his teachings. His funeral was attended by representatives from many different kingdoms, and his grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to honor his memory and continue his work. But the real measure of Confucius's impact was not the attendance at his funeral, but the enduring influence of his ideas and principles. In the generations following his death, his teachings were collected, systematized, and refined by his intellectual heirs. The most important of these collections was the Analects, a compilation of sayings, conversations, and anecdotes that preserved much of the wisdom that had emerged from his years of teaching and reflection. The Analects reveals Confucius not as a distant and imposing authority figure, but as a warm and approachable human being who struggled with many of the same challenges and uncertainties that face all people. He admits his mistakes, expresses uncertainty about difficult questions, and shows genuine pleasure in the company of his friends and students. This humanity, combined with the profundity of his insights, helps explain why his teachings have remained relevant and inspiring across such vast stretches of time and cultural change. The core message that emerges from Confucian thought is fundamentally hopeful and affirming. Despite all the cruelty, injustice, and suffering that characterize much of human history, Confucius maintained his faith in the possibility of moral progress and social improvement. He believed that individuals could develop their character through effort and practice, that relationships could be transformed through mutual care and respect, and that societies could become more just and harmonious through the accumulated efforts of many people working toward common goals. This optimism was not naive or unrealistic. Confucius had witnessed plenty of human selfishness, cruelty, and folly during his long life. He understood that change would come slowly and that there would always be setbacks and disappointments along the way. But he also believed that the alternative to hope and effort was despair and resignation, and he refused to accept that human beings were destined to repeat endlessly the cycles of conflict and suffering that had marked their past. The practical implications of Confucian philosophy extend into virtually every aspect of human life and social organization. In family relationships, it suggests approaches to parenting that combine unconditional love with consistent guidance, helping children develop both confidence and character. In education, it points toward methods that engage students as active participants in their own learning rather than passive recipients of information. In business and professional life, it emphasizes integrity, long-term thinking, and genuine service to others rather than short-term profit maximization. In politics and governance, Confucian principles suggest that the primary qualification for leadership should be moral character rather than wealth, connections, or charismatic appeal. Leaders should be selected and evaluated based on their demonstrated commitment to serving others and their ability to inspire cooperative efforts toward common goals. Policies should be judged not just by their immediate effects, but by their long-term consequences for social harmony and human well-being. Perhaps most importantly, Confucian thought offers a vision of what human life can be at its best. Rather than seeing people as fundamentally selfish creatures who must be controlled through fear and force, it recognizes the capacity for growth, compassion, and wisdom that exists within every person. Rather than accepting that conflict and competition must dominate human relationships, it envisions communities built on mutual support and shared purpose. This vision has inspired countless individuals over the centuries to dedicate their lives to education, public service, and moral development. It has influenced the development of educational systems, legal codes, and governmental structures throughout East Asia and beyond. And it continues to offer guidance and inspiration to anyone who seeks to live a meaningful life and contribute to the well-being of others. The gentle wisdom of Confucius reminds us that the path to a better world begins with our own commitment to continuous learning and moral growth. It suggests that the most powerful force for positive change is not political revolution or technological innovation, but the patient, persistent effort of individuals to become the best versions of themselves and to treat others with the respect and compassion that all human beings deserve. As we navigate the complexities and challenges of our own time, we might find comfort and guidance in the timeless insights of this ancient teacher. His emphasis on the importance of education, the value of diverse perspectives, the need for ethical leadership, and the possibility of progress through collective effort speaks to concerns that remain as relevant today as they were 25 centuries ago. In our interconnected world, where the actions of individuals and nations have far-reaching consequences for people across the globe, the Confucian vision of human interdependence and moral responsibility takes on new urgency. The idea that we all have a stake in each other's well-being and that our own fulfillment depends partly on our ability to contribute to the common good offers a framework for thinking about contemporary challenges such as climate change, economic inequality, and international cooperation. The legacy of Confucius reminds us that wisdom is not just about accumulating knowledge, but about developing the capacity to use that knowledge in ways that make life better for ourselves and others. It suggests that true education involves not just training the mind, but cultivating the heart and strengthening the will to do what is right even when it is difficult. And it affirms that each of us has the potential to make a positive difference in the world, not through grand gestures or dramatic actions, but through the daily practice of treating others with kindness, fulfilling our responsibilities conscientiously, and never ceasing to learn and grow. In the quiet hours before sleep, when the day's work is done and we have time to reflect on what matters most, the gentle teachings of Confucius offer both comfort and challenge. They comfort us with the assurance that our efforts to be good people and do good work are worthwhile, even when the results are not immediately visible. And they challenge us to continue growing, learning, and serving others, recognizing that the journey toward wisdom and compassion is never complete, but always rewarding. The ancient sage who walked the dusty roads of China so long ago, teaching anyone who would listen about the possibilities for human goodness and social harmony, continues to speak to us across the centuries. His voice joins the chorus of all those who have dedicated their lives to making the world a little bit better, a little bit kinder, a little bit more just. In listening to that voice and following its guidance, we become part of that same eternal conversation about what it means to be human and how we can live together in peace and mutual flourishing. As the soft sounds of night settle around us and consciousness gently fades into sleep, we might carry with us the peaceful wisdom of Confucius, knowing that tomorrow offers new opportunities to practice compassion, to learn something new, to strengthen our relationships with others, and to contribute in our own small way to the ancient human dream of a world marked not by conflict and suffering, but by harmony, understanding, and love. In this way, the teachings of the gentle philosopher become not just historical curiosities, but living principles that continue to guide us toward the light of wisdom and the warmth of human connection.